You're wired in. SmallCapVoice.com. Following is a presentation of SmallCapVoice.com, today's leader in investor relations, capital formation, and retail support. Now, with your online business briefing, SmallCapVoice.com's Stuart T. Smith.
Welcome one, welcome all to this online business briefing brought to you by SmallCapVoice.com. And I'm your host, Stuart Smith. And we are joined today for the very first time by Victory Resources. Victory Resources Corporation is traded on the over-the-counter QX exchange here in the United States under the ticker symbol VRCFF. And in Canada, they are traded under the ticker symbol VR on the TSX Venture Exchange. Now, we're joined today by Corey Safran. He is the VP of Strategic Development. Corey, how are you today?
Well, very good, Stuart, and thanks for having us, and we look forward to telling you about our story.
Absolutely. Well, let's start there. Let's start with the story of Victory Resources. For our listeners who may not be familiar with the company, describe the company and its business model for us.
Well, sure. Victory Resources has two properties, one in Mexico, in the Sinaloa, Chihuahua region of Mexico, and that's, for those who don't know the geography, that's closer to the west coast. And we also have a property right near Merritt, British Columbia. Both properties are polymetallic. In Mexico, primary metal would be copper and many byproduct metals that go along with that. And in the Merritt, BC property, it would be a copper and gold property.
Well, very good, Corey. You and I were talking in preparation of this audio interview a little bit about your company, its philosophies, and a lot of our listeners are very familiar with the mining industry and how the status quo has been for many of the young development junior miners out there. Your philosophy, it's unique to me in the sense that you've got a business model and approach to this that makes a whole lot of sense, and I hate to be critical of some of your predecessors and peers, but when it comes to mining, so many people, they stake all their claims on things that are in the ground, and yet they have none of the resources to get those things out of the ground. And so your company is frugal and prudent are the two words I would use to describe it, and I think that's a fantastic thing for a development stage company and for micro-cap and small-cap investors to hear. So if you would, let's learn a little bit about the company's philosophy.
Well, sure, and our philosophy and our strategy really comes from our business leadership within the company, driven by the president, Wally Boguski. We really take our cues from the marketplace, and for those who follow the mining sector know that metal in the ground today in the public markets really is valued at a greater than 99% discount. Just an example, copper today is $3.50 a pound. A junior explorer pre-production, their copper in the ground gets valued at around 3.5 cents per pound, and that's 99%. And 3.5 cents is quite honestly on the high side at the moment. And that's a pretty difficult environment for any junior explorer really to advance their projects when their asset is valued at very little. Contrast that with a producing mining company, well, then you get valued quite differently, much more on a cash flow basis, and as opposed to a 99% discount, a mining company typically, if we're talking about copper, and let's use the same example, can see cash flow anywhere between $1.50 and $2.50 a pound. So it's a dramatic difference, and that's really where you see the wealth creation for investors, is when companies graduate from the pre-production valuation model to the post-production cash flow model. So we've looked at the marketplace and our properties, and simply put, our strategy is not to prove the largest resource in the ground, which, as we just discussed, gets very little value. We want to prove the minimum amount of resource that is economically viable to mine, because we know that metal above the ground that's mined is worth a lot more than metal in the ground. And that's what we're doing. So we want to really shorten the time frame for our engineering project, and we are looking to prove out an economically viable resource. That's what we're doing on both our properties, and we are going to require less CapEx and execute our model.
Well, it just makes so much sense, and I'll leave it at that. I won't pontificate further on it, but that's really the way it should be, and it makes a lot of sense to me. And listeners, once again, we are speaking with Corey Safran. He is the VP of Strategic Development for Victory Resources. Now let's learn a little bit about yourself, Corey, and then the other members of the management team, advisory board, geologists, directors. Tell me who's important there at Victory Resources.
Sure, I can give you a little bit of my background to start. I spent 15 years in the capital markets in Canada. Of course, anyone who does do work in capital markets in Canada automatically does quite a bit of work in the resource sector, as I have done. So I was able to gain quite a bit of business experience in that part of the industry, and I've also been involved for the last 5 years directly in the metals industry. In fact, including trading physical metals, so very familiar with the global marketplace. Wally Boguski, the president of Victory Resources, also has a very strong history on the business side in the metals industry, has been a consultant and strategic manager in terms of capital raises. He's actually gained a tremendous experience and knowledge directly in mining and geology. And it's really the strong business side that shapes our strategy. However, on the geology side, I mean, we couldn't be more fortunate to have the geologists that work for us and the geologists that we have doing consulting for us. I mean, it's really the dream team. And the geology world, by the way, Stuart, I mean, because we went through such a long period in the 80s and 90s of really the commodity sector being out of favor, geologists today are either very experienced in their mid-60s to 70 years old, or perhaps just getting into the field. There's a real void of talent. We're fortunate enough to have geologists who have been in the industry for 40-plus years, have worked on the largest projects in the world, Olympic Dam, Cananea, Alumbrera, and it's so important because the geologists on any project are really the ones that give credibility to the drill results and scoping measurements that follow in any technical report.
Well, Corey, moving to the next section, talk to me about the value proposition for Victory Resources. In other words, what's the message to potential investors about this company?
Well, sure. And let's start with our property, one of our properties in Mexico, the Reforma property, where we're currently active with a drill program. And it's important to mention to your listeners that the Reforma property actually has a history of production. It was in production between 1968 and 1980, run by the Penoles company. In 1980, there was some labor issues, which temporarily stopped production. And like a lot of commodity companies in the early 80s, as the commodity prices started to decline, some of these projects just were never put back into production, as was the case with Reforma. So Reforma was an operating mine and with some extremely high grades of production, and was stopped for reasons unrelated to production results. So we're very fortunate to really be picking up exactly where that property was left off, and of course we're doing all the necessary drilling to comply with all the regulations that we need to for the TSX to prove out the current resource. Now, just to give the listeners an idea of valuation, let's just use a tiny number in terms of a resource size. Let's assume we prove out 1 million metric ton, and that is tiny. 1 million metric ton at the grades that Reforma was yielding in previous production would probably have an in-situ value of $300 million. That's not all profit, but this is a high-margin industry, and a good amount of it does drop to the bottom line of cash flow to the company. Now, that's a tiny amount, 1 million. We certainly expect to prove out much greater than 1 million metric tons. Our current market value as we speak today is around $20 million. So, I mean, I don't want to give, certainly, according to regulations, can't give too much forecasting, and I don't want to, but just to set out, just as an example to your listeners, how the value creation and wealth creation can be achieved once we get the acknowledgement of the resource size that we expect to get.
Well, understood, and we appreciate that insight. Let's move on and talk a little bit about geography. Let's talk about what it's like to be a mining company in Mexico. We've seen Goldcorp recently have two projects that they've invested over $1.5 billion into. So obviously that provides validation to the geography of Mexico. Talk to me about being a mining company in Mexico today.
Well, sure, and that's really important. I mean, mining properties are in locations very much different than Times Square in New York. They're all over the world in countries that have different political situations. Just some statistics on Mexico. Mexico today is the number one exporter of silver. It just cracked the top 10 in terms of exporter of gold. Goldcorp has two projects there. Each of them they've invested individually more than $500 million, and I think one of them is close to $1 billion in terms of investment. It is a country with a very favorable tax system, ownership rules and laws, so it attracts a lot of foreign investment into mining. As far as infrastructure is concerned, which is really important, Mexico, and not a lot of people know this, but Mexico just completed one of the largest infrastructure projects connecting Odessa, Texas to the West Coast with a brand new state-of-the-art highway system and rail system. West Coast Mexico, for anyone who knows their geography, is a great access point, a great shipping point, I should say, to the Asian markets. Our property, Victory Resources, is about 7 miles from that brand new highway and rail system. We couldn't have picked a better geography and location in terms of infrastructure, so we're very lucky to have that. And, highways bring exits bring businesses bring people, so we know we're going to have great access to labor as well, working on our property, skilled labor, and also easy access for equipment. So we couldn't be more pleased with the infrastructure and logistics and geopolitical situation in Mexico.
Well, let's hit the press wire right now. Listeners, you can follow along. Here in the States, use that ticker symbol one more time. That's VRCFF. And north of the border there in Canada, on the TSX Venture Exchange, that's VR. And Victory Resources is for the company's name. And follow along on this news. Came out July 12th. Victory Resources Corp completes transaction for the El Boleo property. Let's get your insight into this.
Oh, sure. The El Boleo property is an adjacent property to our current Reforma property, and it was really just a very strategic acquisition to expand our property right in that region. And with the acquisition of the Boleo property, we now have over 20,000 hectares of continuous land. Early testing shows the same geochemical anomaly in the El Boleo as the Reforma. The transaction structure is low risk because it's very much related to results and the drill program that we're going to be conducting at El Boleo, and it gives us just a great opportunity to have a world-class size resource. So we're very fortunate to have been in a position to acquire the El Boleo.
And now let's talk about the completion of the drill program on the Tailings Pond. Listeners, this came out Tuesday, July 3rd. Tell us a little bit about Tailings Pond.
Sure. The Tailings Pond is the result of the operations in the Reforma property by Penoles between 1968 and 1980. And there's about 1.8 million metric tons, thereabouts approximately, in the Tailings Pond. Tailings Pond, very simple, is an opportunity to reprocess the material and extract metals through better technology than what was available when it was originally drilled. And early testing shows us that this tailings pond maybe, and will soon confirm, has a very high value metal content that can be extracted and monetized for the company in the very near term.
And there's one additional property I'd like to discuss with you. It's the property located in British Columbia, the Merritt property. Give us a little bit about this.
Well, yeah, in the Merritt property, and similar to Reforma, and again consistent with our strategy, we are a low-risk management group. The Merritt property is a property that does also have a history, a very rich history in mining. That region, we, again, couldn't be more ideally located. We have 40,000 hectares, and I know this is this is audio, so people aren't looking at the map, and I invite them to go to our website to see the map. Our property in Merritt to the west is a tiny property that Xstrata just optioned, and to the south is the Elk project from Gold Mountain, also tiny compared to our 40,000 hectares. And again, the success of our neighbors, the history of mining, will implement the same strategy to prove out an economically viable resource. Will be a near-term success and event for our shareholders. So we're very excited about that.
Listeners, once again, we're speaking with Corey Safran, who also happens to be, in addition to the VP of Strategic Development, the investor relations contact on that website that Corey just alluded to. That website is Victory Resources Corp.com. You can reach Corey directly at 609-228-0595 or Corey, Corey, at victoryresourcescorp.com. Corey, thank you so much for your time here today. It was a fascinating interview. We appreciate you here at SmallCapVoice.com, and we wish you best of luck here in the year 2012 and beyond for Victory Resources. Thanks, Corey.
Thanks, Stuart. I look forward to talking to you soon.
Very good. For Corey Safran, this is Stuart Smith saying thanks so much for listening.
SmallCapVoice.com, today's leader in investor relations, capital formation, and retail support, provides its clients with the highest level of service. Our audio interviews are disseminated to one of the largest opt-in audiences available today. How? We at SmallCapVoice.com believe in aligning and affiliating ourselves with other leaders within the investor relations community. By sharing resources, each affiliated firm is made that much stronger and each client is served that much better. Our focus is to identify and provide the very best financial services and solutions available to clients and their shareholders. For more information about our services, please call us at 512-267-2430 or visit us on the web at www.smallcapvoice.com. This is a broadcast of SmallCapVoice.com, a financial communications and investor relations firm. SmallCapVoice.com receives payment for investor relations and financial consulting services that it provides to its clients. You should assume that officers, directors, and employees of SmallCapVoice.com or financial analysts mentioned and their families hold a position and intend to trade in these securities for their own accounts. This is not an offer or recommendation to buy or sell securities. Information in this broadcast is presented solely for informative purposes and is not intended to be, nor should it be construed as, investment advice. As in all investments, an investment in the featured company carries an investment risk. Listeners should review the company thoroughly with a registered investment advisor or registered stockbroker. This broadcast does not purport to be a complete study of the featured company or other companies mentioned. Information used and statements of fact have been obtained from the featured company and other sources but not verified nor guaranteed by SmallCapVoice.com as to completeness or accuracy. Such information is subject to change without notice.